In today's video, we're going to add on to my growing Warhammer 40K force with a hulking, monstrous flesh golem crafted by the homunculus covens. The last time I painted a similar model was over 10 years ago, before I was even on YouTube. We'll compare the two models at the end of the video to show how much I've grown as a painter and how radically this scheme has changed for this army. Let's jump in. With the cleanup and some assembly done, I decided to do something that I generally am not a big fan of: sub-assembly paint jobs. I think this particular model lends itself to it. Not only will I get more mileage out of the airbrush step, but also every single connection point has an overlapping part, so no gap filling is required. With a mixture of double-sided tape, poster tack, and also pinning, I attach the various parts of the Kronos to cork and dowels and whatever I have in my drawer. I prime the model in black and then get to laying down my first base coats. Because the model is in parts, the order of operations is less precious here. So let's start with the armor. With that khaki layer looking nice and opaque, let's move on to highlighting and shading the carapace. This was a 5-layer process. First, I mixed some parchment-colored paint with my original khaki to get my first highlight. Whenever I want to mix a stepping stone between two paints, I always think that it's one part of one paint and one part of the other. But realistically, you need much less of the darker color than you do the lighter color if you're trying to do an even step in between them. Here on screen, you can see the colors that I am using. Sometimes, to get my head in the right framework, I'll do a dirty pour of the next paint. Basically, I dump out all the paint from the previous step and add the next one. And whatever remnant is left in my airbrush is oftentimes enough to mix that stepping stone color. While highlighting this shape, it can be tempting to want to do a single stripe right down the middle. But it's important to think about what this thing looks like from top down. It's fat in the front and gets narrow in the back. And the curvature of the carapace also mimics that. It's more sloping and gradual in the front and tighter and sharper in the back. Our highlighting efforts should mimic this shape. Eventually, I work my way up to pure white. In this case, I'm using white ink. With some highlights in place, I add some shading with some sepia ink, and originally, I don't thin it enough. You can see the speckling, and it's also applying too opaquely. I also accidentally blast the side of the carapace with too much ink as well. Some ink needs a lot of thinner, and some ink doesn't need very much. In this case, I needed more. To fix that problem, I come back with some of that original base tone, the khaki, to cover up some of that dark color, but even that didn't look super good. So as one last step, I bring back some more sepia ink, this time actually thinned well, to blend out some of that shadow. With the gradient on the carapace looking nice and smooth, I decide now is the time to put on one of my decals. This is a custom decal that I made of a buzzsaw blade with elongated teeth to look kind of like a mean-looking sun. I cut the decal out, put it in a little container with some water, and then laid it on one of the nice big flat parts of the Kronos' armor. Even though this is a big, nice flat part, there are still tiny little wrinkles in the decal due to the curvature of the armor. To make sure the decal lies flat, I take some micro sol and just paint it on top, and that seems to do the job. Once everything was nice and dry, I blasted the whole armor with some high gloss varnish. Not only is this one extra layer on top of the decal to help it blend with the surface, but also it's going to help with the next step, which if you've watched any of my dark color videos, you'll know is a nice crispy oil wash. With a mixture of burnt umber and a little bit of ivory black, I pin wash all the nice panel lines. I don't bother with the tiny little studs at the very front because I know I can just do that with normal brown paint later on and it'll look much better. After a nice long cure of about 16 hours, I came back to the office and started to wipe away the oil wash. On the carapace, it was very simple. I didn't even need mineral spirits. Just a dry makeup sponge was enough to get rid of 90% of the problems. For the little spikes, however, some more precision was necessary. With a brush and some mineral spirits, I carefully painted around the cones to make sure a nice little dark ring was remaining, and every once in a while I used a sponge to soak up the excess. When all is said and done, this looks pretty awesome, and took next to no time compared to how long it would take if I were to paint these in by hand with acrylic paint. As one final step, I applied some matte varnish to prevent further oil paint activation, but also to knock back some of that glossy finish. With the airbrushing all done on the carapace, we can now move on to the brush work. I'll begin with some battle damage. Mixing some of my original khaki with a nice dark brown color, I'll start to paint in some chips. I'm just trying to do this where it makes most sense, like on the edges of the segmented armor. I also like to drag my brush a little bit to imply that a projectile hit the edge and tore up a streak of paint. That often looks kind of cool. I also used this step as an opportunity to cover up some of my oil paint mishaps. Apparently there were still some smudges left over from my cleanup step. Also with this color, I'll paint all the tiny little spikes. Remember earlier how I said we wouldn't bother with the oil paint on these little guys? I find that this is a much better way to add crispy, recessed shading to small, shallow details like this. I'll also do some chipping on the decal itself, which just helps to hide it even more, blending it with the surface. On my other dark Eldar, I often have a few yellow armor panels to break up the cream color, and for some reason I didn't really want to do that on this guy. But as an alternative, I thought I'd add a freehand that uses mostly yellow. I'll trace in my shapes with a nice medium yellow color, and then once that's looking nice and sharp, I'll highlight it with a brighter off-white yellow, and then shade the bottom with a nice orange color to get kind of a sunburst feel. It's looking pretty good, but it's also kind of looking like one of the homunculi in my army has got a pretty sick skill for graffiti. As one final step, I'll outline the graffiti. As one final step, I will outline the freehand with a nice dark brown color. I find this pops it out really nicely. Then I also weathered this too. One last grimy step on this carapace. I took some more of that brown oil paint and applied it unthinned to the vents. And then with another brush, wetted with mineral spirits, I feathered that little blob of oil paint to a nice drip. You can get both a nice tinted color, but also a really nice thin strand of drippy goo. With the carapace done, or at least past Scott thinks he's done and is mentally checked out, I moved on to the next part. For the weapon racks on his back, I airbrushed on a simple black to gray gradient, and then did a few touch-up highlights with my paintbrush. Next on the weapon rack, I painted the blades silver a couple of times, and then with Drakenhof Nightshade, I glazed a blue color toward the bottom of the blade. Then with my brightest silver color, I edge highlighted those blades as well, and then finally splattered some blood on. With a mixture of Tamiya clear red and black ink, I flicked some blood droplets onto these weapon racks. In order to get this splatter to work nicely, whatever you're flicking needs to be fairly thin. Mixing Tamiya clear with ink is definitely not thin enough to get this to work, and so I had to mix in some X20A to get a nice thin solution that would splatter nicely. With the weapon rack done, I decided to glue it into the finished carapace. I was too excited to see this mod come together. I was a bit confused what direction this part was supposed to go in because I figured that the sharp part of the knives would be facing forward, but apparently they're facing backwards. All right, GW, sure. Apparently I was a bit too excited to glue in those racks because I forgot to edge highlight the white armor, the last step of that white armor process. That's okay, I just need to be a bit more careful now. To maintain the grimy, weathered appearance, I don't do a perfect edge highlight, I just do a spotty, scratchy one. I am super happy with how that carapace turned out. Let's move on to the other big component of this model, the dude below. Honestly, I'm not even sure if a Kronos qualifies as a dude. It doesn't take much convincing to know that these guys are not well off. Because of that, we need some appropriately dead looking color for his skin. I mixed some blue into a skin tone color, which got me essentially a cold gray that I used to base coat the model. I then zenithly highlighted the skin with that same skin tone color, but with just no blue mixed in. This brings back some warmth and also some shape for the nice rippling muscles on this big daddy. Keeping in the theme of blue, I mix in an off-white blue into the skin tone to get a highlight. I'm using blue in this case to, again, make the skin look more sickly, but also to call back to a spot color in my scheme, which is teal. Learning my lesson from the carapace, I take some blue and black ink and this time adequately thin it down to add some nice deep shadows. I also use this to make the ends of the tendrils nice and dark blue. I often save my various layers of mixed airbrush paint. Because I'm not an amazing airbrusher, I find that most often for me, I need to go back and forth with my highlights and shadows to get a nice, smooth result. I messed around quite a bit with black and blue ink to make sure that the ends of these tendrils were nice and dark and that there was a nice blue gradation into that darkness. With the skin looking sufficiently creepy, I also apply an oil wash to it. This time, a mixture of Payne's Gray, a nice dark blue, and a tiny amount of magenta. You'll notice that this time, I'm not varnishing the model. That's because I want some of this oil wash to stain the surface. At least I think I do. Fingers crossed that it actually looks good once I clean it off. The skin is a mixture of highly defined details with the little metal couplings and hoses, but also softly defined details like his big muscles. I'm hoping to get the best of both worlds with an oil wash. I left the oil wash to dry overnight, and for the tentacle part, I poster tacked it to my monitor upside down so that if gravity was going to do anything, it was going to pull the oil wash down toward the dark part of the tentacles. Let's see how much of a difference just a change in finish makes to cleaning up an oil wash. Initially, I tried a dry sponge with no mineral spirits, and that was doing nothing. I then took a mega sponge with some mineral spirits in it and started to wipe away at the oil paint, and it worked pretty good. I can tell that the oil wash is staining the lighter highlights, and there's some paint that I'm unable to get up entirely. In the deep details by all those creepy homunculi bits, the definition is pretty good. The oil wash worked particularly well on the tentacle bits, so that's a nice bonus. In some of the shallower details, I'm totally pulling up the oil wash because I'm being way more aggressive during this cleanup step than I was the earlier brown one. All in all, it looks okay. I'm not sure that an oil wash is the right play for softly defined details like muscles. It might be a better idea to paint in your shading with just straight up oil paint, no thinner at all, and then to feather it out. That'd give you more control over where the shading goes, and also give you the speed of blending oil paints that acrylic paints does not afford you. Next on the skin, I wanted to add some bruising, and I did that with some very thinned down magenta ink through my airbrush. The problem with this step is that virtually every part of this guy's body seems like it should have some kind of bruising on it, so I had to kind of be a little bit reserved. I applied it around where his skin is getting pulled back by these meat hooks, around the wrists, and also around the big chest sensor thing. The life of a Chronos Parasite engine is not a good one. Later, I felt like I wasn't the biggest fan of the magenta, so I covered it up with some red ink as well, which had the added benefit of intensifying the damaged skin effect, which I think was needed. After applying a varnish over the skin's oil wash and also the ink, it was time to apply some highlights with a paintbrush. Now this is a little difficult to describe. I'm armed with the same colors that I used during the airbrushing stage, even the magenta ink. I'm trying to strengthen highlights by adding more Arctic blue, bring back some warmth in the skin tone by adding more of that skin tone color, and just generally diagnosing the model as I move around it. Because this process is a bit hard to describe, here's a live version of me painting a portion of this model. Hi, hopefully this will give you a better idea about how I approach painting the skin on this Chronos. I want to add some highlight right here to his rib cage, side of his chest, and also on the back here where his tricep is. And so let's do that. So I'm gonna start by grabbing a little bit of my ice Arctic blue, and just kind of laying it down right there. I'll grab some of the skin tone that I used and kind of put some on there as well. I'm kind of randomly using skin tone versus Arctic blue, which doesn't seem like a good idea, but I just am kind of where I'm feeling it. And then I just grab some of this mixture here, which is a mixture of dark sea blue and my skin tone, which are the original colors that I used to shade the model with the airbrush. And so I just mixed them together to kind of get a desaturated gray blue. I'll put some down, and then hopefully while it's still wet, I'll like try to blend that into that area. And you know what? I'm kind of liking the color of that more than I did the Arctic blue. So I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna paint on top of that Arctic blue that I added to his tricep earlier. I just think it looks better. Even though this guy is like, you know, definitely worse for wear. At some point he was a guy. He is still kind of human, so some warmth in the skin is needed. He's got a little bit of a muscle back here that pops out, and so I'm gonna grab some of that dark sea blue and the skin tone mixed together to kind of get a little bit of an elbow highlight going. It's mostly dark down there and dark and blue, and so because it's dark and blue, I want to add kind of more of a bluish highlight as well. So less of a skin tone highlight, more of a bluish highlight. So it's still a highlight, but just like a darker one. Okay. Honestly, that went a lot better than I thought I was gonna go. But that's basically what I'm trying to do. Was that helpful? I don't know. If you're not aware, I'm painting up my Dark Eldar army as a collaboration with Eons of Battle, another YouTuber. He challenged me to paint up a Warhammer 40K army, and he's doing the same. In fact, he's also doing a Drakari army. Every addition we make to the army is worth points in a system Jay developed, and when we're done with our respective armies, we'll compare scores to see who wins this massive hobby showdown. I have linked some of his videos in the description, and you should definitely go check them out for more Dark Eldar goodness. All right, back to my Chronos. With the skin all done, I begin to work on some of the metallic bits. Here's where I got the great idea to paint every single individual clip on each tentacle arm in silver, which I felt like was a cool idea, but in practice was mildly traumatic. After an extremely tedious base coat job, I could move on to some washing. And I'm being pretty selective with this washing all of the silver parts. I'm only gonna add shading where there is detail that needs to be pronounced. It would've been a lot smarter of me to base coat this silver before doing the blue oil wash, but you know, I didn't. The last step for the silver was a nice, bright, poppy edge highlight. I didn't bother to do this on the larger areas of flat silver, like on his wrists and whatnot, just the smaller little bits. With all those clips painted, let's double down the tedium and paint the hose that runs in between all of those bits a different color. So much fun! I know in the box art they paint the whole thing to be like metal, but I think it's way cooler to imagine this tube as like performance-enhancing drugs running the entire length of the arm, because how else could this hulking monstrosity actually exist? Only pumped up with drugs! While working on the hoses on the arms, I also painted the hoses on the chest. And there are quite a few in the chest, so I broke them up with a yellow hose as well. I am doing a bit of highlighting and shading on these hoses, but I'm not thinking too hard about where the shadows and highlights should go. I'm more concerned about just having a cool gradient on the hose than it being logical and realistic, because honestly, look at this guy. There's a lot of detail on these tentacle arms, and I wanted to keep adding more and more to them. I added some more red ink inflammation. These parts are a prominent feature on the model, so I wanted to make sure they looked great. It took a long time to tediously paint all the segments of those tubes. Good thing there's 4 more to do. Kill me. Oh boy. Next, let's move on to the creepy drug pods on the rib cage of the Chronos. Trying to leverage the fact that this is a sub-assembly paint job, I'm gonna paint the majority of this with an airbrush. After a nice opaque white undercoat, I paint some of them teal and some of them yellow. With the base coat done, I do another one of those dirty pours that I mentioned earlier to get a brighter highlight with white ink. And with this color, I'm trying to carefully go around the bottom of these vials to make it look like they're brighter at that end. I'm using pretty thin paint here, which is allowing me to lower the PSI, which then in turn lets me get closer to this tiny little piece. I'm also aiming low. If you can imagine, the airbrush shoots out a cone of paint, and I don't want the middle of that cone to hit where I want. I want the top of that cone to hit where I want. With that brighter highlight added to both yellow and teal vials, I next go for an ink to shade the other side of them. Again, imagining a cone coming out of the airbrush, I want the bottom side of the cone to hit the top of the vial. So I'll aim above them and sneak up onto the actual location that I want. Here is the final result, and it's not perfect, but it looks pretty good. To finish up the vials, I took a whitewash product that I discovered while at PAX Unplugged and applied it right around the rim just to give the implication that it gets super bright right at the top. Next, I wanted to add some bubbles to these vials, and at first I painted them on, but it was very clearly looking bad. I was way too intentional and programmed about it. It needed to be more random. So I took some of that whitewash, watered it down a little bit more, and then splattered it onto the vials to get a bunch of dots of various sizes. But also because I diluted it, they dry kind of translucent. So it's more of a subtle effect. After that was dry, I hit the vials with some gloss varnish to make them look nice and glass-like. To finish them up, I paint the metallics on the vials just like I did the rest of the miniature. Now, onto some significantly shinier silver. I applied this nice mirrored silver to his face shield and also the weird spiral disc thing on his back that I can only imagine is like the opposite of a dream catcher. Nightmare Spewer? For the mask and the spirit siphon thing on his back, I took Tamiya Clear that I thinned with X20A and applied a nice gradient of blue to the outside of the disc, getting lighter as it got to the center. I did the same with his mask, but I was focusing more on the bottom side of the mask. With that done, it was time to do the ultra tedious process of painting all the raised detail in a black color. I was also layering up highlights. So instead of painting everything black, I painted the outermost part black, and then as I got more toward the center of the disc, I used more and more of a gray color. I did the same thing on the helmet. I highlighted the trim at the top of his head, but I was a little bit more intentional about adding edge highlights to various parts of his helmet trim, just because it's a forward-facing detail, and I wanted it to look a little bit nicer.
Damn it, I should have brought one of my pistolas.
How I painted the remaining details on the head has already been gone over in the past, like the dead flesh, the inflammation, cables, and whatnot. What's new, however, is that gnarly proboscis, and I was feeling like trying something a little bit different. I painted on a nice black to gray gradient, and then I covered that gradient in yellow ink. Yellow is a color that's hard to mix with black, and I find that doing this approach is a little bit easier. With that gradient in place, I also covered it in a gloss varnish. As a last nasty step, I took some Uhu glue that's definitely a little bit too old and hard to work with, and added some slime to his tendrils. And with the slime sliming, we'll assemble this flesh golem like the homunculi themselves. I say this all the time, but I had an absolute blast painting this model. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of the Coven models in the Dark Eldar range, but this guy was great. It took me a lot longer to paint him than I thought. Because I painted the shell and the body early on, I felt like I was making great progress, but I got super bogged down in all the flim-flams, as my buddy Jay would say. This model was a test, re-exploring sub-assembly paint jobs, and it wasn't without its problems. I messed up the orientation of the butt tentacles, highlighting what eventually became the bottom and not the top. I also didn't paint the inside of his lower armor because I thought it wouldn't be seen, but I was wrong about that. Lastly, I don't really think my paint scheme came together nicely. The dead flesh doesn't really pair nicely with the cream-colored armor, and I might have caught that earlier on if the Mini was in one piece. These are all problems that I'm aware of, and honestly even more, but I don't really care, simply because the process was so much fun and the amount of work I invested in this model is helping me to love it despite its issues. Overall, I probably spent around 35 hours on this guy to give you an idea. Comparing the Kronos to the old Talos, it's clear I'm a better painter, which is what you want to see. This was also back in the day of me trying as hard as possible on every single model. And on the Kronos, that's not the case, making the comparison even more encouraging. I remember being extremely proud of the conversion I had on this old Talos. Mixing YouTube with my hobby has all sorts of interesting side effects, one of them being my productivity. There is no chance I would have painted this many models 10 years later if not for YouTube. But likely the models that I would have painted might be a little bit better because there's no timeline encouraging me to finish models quickly like there is with a video release schedule. One of the reasons I worked on this Mini was because of my patrons. Every single month they vote on something for me to paint, and this time Warhammer 40K narrowly beat out Star Wars. If you want to have some say over what I paint each month, consider checking out my Patreon so you can ensure that I never paint Star Wars. Seriously, it's been in every single poll and it has never won. What's the deal, guys? Come on. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways that you can do that. All things linked down in the description. Like I said previously, a Patreon campaign is a great way to do that. You can join my Discord and I can harass you about liking Tomb Kings. You can also check out Miniac.co where I sell some hobby tools like this awesome cutting mat, a brush box to hold all your hobby tools, and some merch, and also some miniatures like my vampire model or some of my wood elves. I also sell masterclass courses along with those larger display models that teach you not only how to paint the model like I do in the box art, but also all the skills required to do that. It's a fully encapsulated learning experience. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint my minis!